We are at, this is our final CST webinar for 2021. I'm Siri, I'm part of the BC Seed Security Program, and on our call we also have David Katzel, Sarah, who's our Thompson Caribou Seed Coordinator, and Lisa, who is our Vancouver Island Coordinator, all very knowledgeable folks. So I'd like to start it off with a land acknowledgement. While we are meeting virtually today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home, the land we live on, work with, and plant our seeds into. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Indigenous people that call this land home. We recognize the long-standing relationship between the land and all Indigenous peoples, which precedes the establishment of Canada and is affected by the violence of colonialism, capitalism, and ongoing racism. By living here, working here, and using the resources of this place, we now participate in this experience. As part of the process to be accountable to our role in this ongoing violence, we invite you to reflect on these questions with us. What are our obligations to the Indigenous peoples who first inhabited and continue to inhabit this land? And how can we support existing local struggles of Indigenous peoples along with preservation, resurgence, and development? And the last one, how do we live and farm as good treaty people? We also would encourage you to learn the history of the land you are on by visiting Whose Land or native-land.ca. Great. So as you guys know, Citizen Seed Trial this year, we did 3 crops: tomatoes, snow peas, and beets. For tomatoes, we compared the Alpharora and Stupice. Snow peas was Beauregard and Slocan. And the beets, we had 2 F2 crosses, one called Golden Shigoya and the other called F2 Striped Gold Mix. Okay, so we'll start it off with tomatoes, followed by snow peas, and then beets. So here are just a couple pictures of the Stupice and Alpharora, and I'm just going to quickly go through our results, and then we can talk about it afterwards. So for germination, you can see they're pretty similar, but the Stupice is did a bit better than the Alpharora. Same with vigor. Slocan, again, slightly outcompeted the Alpharora. And then for disease resistance, we see similarly, they're both ranked a bit higher than the other 2 traits, but still just did slightly better. Slocan, for insect resistance, you can see both crops fared similarly. And earliness, I feel like this is where we see our first big kind of discrepancy. We can see that the Slocan on the left did quite a bit better when it comes to earliness compared to the Beauregard. Sorry, I think I might have, wait, sorry. The Stupice did quite a bit better than the Alpharora. Sorry about that. And then height, we see they were marked pretty much exactly the same. These 2 crops were pretty similar. And then appearance, we also see that Stupice did a bit better than Alpharora, but I feel like appearance was a bit difficult, at least for me, to distinguish on this trial because they were similar tomatoes, but the Stupice was maybe a bit smaller and kind of plumper, whereas the Alpharora was a bit more of an oval shape. So hard to compare appearance because they were very similar kind of tomatoes. Flavor, we can see that the Stupice did a bit better than the Alpharoras. As for yield, this is where we see another discrepancy that's quite large, where the Stupice did a lot better than the Alpharora. And I would say this might have to do with the fact that the Stupice was earlier. So those 2 traits might be slightly correlated in this case, but this is just projections. And then here we have overall. This one kind of surprised me because despite Stupice kind of ranking a bit higher on most of the traits, overall, everybody kind of rated them very similarly. But then if you instead of doing overall, if you do an addition of all the traits, the individual traits, and put them together, you see that the Stupice did do a few more points better than the Alpharora, which I thought was kind of interesting, that if you add them all up, Stupice does better, but in general, people rated the overall very similarly. And then we'll go into some qualitative data. I always like qualitative data. So this is some of the comments for Stupice. And there's a few things about the drought, because we know this summer we had that big heat dome, which I think was some big, a big event this summer, I would say, that would have affected all of our trials. So someone said it was a hard year to make a final judgment in, since the weather was unusually hot and dry. They might grow it again to see what happens in a different year, but overall perfectly average as a tomato. But given there's so many exciting tomato varieties, I would probably pass on growing again and choose something different next year. I think that's an interesting point. They were pretty normal standard tomatoes, I would say, both the Stupice and Alpharora. Someone was impressed they were able to germinate and live for a whole week during a drought. And someone also said the heat dome made this hard to rank because pollination was cooked and timing was off. So definitely pollination can be affected by high heats. We saw at our farm, we had this one broccoli plant that was flowering during the heat dome, and it had lower rates of seed filling, probably due to a lack of pollination. So another person said good growth, but did not like the heat dome or cold spring, because yes, we had quite a cold spring followed by quite high heat, bit of difficult conditions. A couple comments were it was too small and hard to peel, and tomatoes a little on the small size. That's again for the Stupice, which I guess the Stupice were a bit smaller, like the fruits, than the Alpharora, at least I found. Other people said early, hard to eat, and productive but bland. And another way to put but bland is light, mild flavor, very plentiful, which is, I guess, similar to the early and hardy. So some of the comments for the Alpharora was that germination was spotty and vigor was poor. Another person had a problem with poor germination, but this person had germination 10 out of 12 seeds and was the first to germinate. So getting some feedback on both sides there. And then the Alpharora, I found this kind of interesting because a few people commented on their cultivation style. So this person planted 3 in the greenhouse and 3 outside, and they found that the outside ones struggled while the greenhouse ones were doing great. And this kind of thing is really interesting because from this we could pull and do a trial, you know, greenhouse versus in field or something like that, if people wanted to look into that effect more and see how these tomatoes fare in different production systems. And somebody else said delicious and good yield in containers. They tried them both in containers and a raised bed, but they perform better in the containers. So that's another kind of interesting point that people could look into, as I know a lot of people in the Citizen Seed trial are living in apartments and doing things on their balcony. So having small size plants can be good, and things that are good for a container garden are obviously good for balconies. So maybe Alpharora might make a good balcony tomato based off of that comment. A few people just said mild flavor, bland flavor, not early or productive, late producing. It did, we found at the farm that it came quite a bit later than the Stupice, so it wasn't early, which was a bit surprising. We thought it was going to be an early one, but that's one of the reasons why we do these trials, is to find out things like this. So the big reveal is, I would say, the winner, if there is a winner, is Stupice. And the reasons is it was earlier, and we could definitely see that in our results. It had a higher yield, which again might be correlated to it being earlier, and potentially it might have had better germination in poor conditions. Now this is based off of both that the germination rating was a bit higher for Stupice, but also based off of some of the qualitative data, some of the comments we had that spoke to Stupice seemingly doing better in hard environments for germinating. So we had 63% of people say they would like to grow Stupice again, while only 43% of people wanted to grow Alpharora again. And to me, that's what matters the most, is would someone grow this again? I feel like that's a big thing to consider. So now we'll just go into some seed saving tips for tomatoes. I know probably a lot of you have already harvested your tomatoes, but we still have some kicking about. A good thing to do is to ferment your tomato seeds. This helps get rid of the gelatinous layer. So to ferment your tomato seeds, you're just going to take your tomato, cut it in half, scoop out the seeds, and then leave it in a jar for about 3 to 7 days. You'll see a kind of like foam forms on the top, kind of moldy. You can kind of see it in the jar on the left, that little white layer. And then after 3 to 7 days, it'll start to separate and it kind of looks like a parfait, I guess. And the stuff on the bottom is the good seeds that you want to keep. And the stuff on the top is usually the unviable lighter seeds, as well as the kind of tomato gunk. And then stuff in the middle is water. Generally, you'll add water also to the mixture. And then you just want to decant the mixture. So continuously pour out the top, fill it with water, let the seeds come down, pour out the top, just generally decanting. And then you'll want to let your seeds dry completely. Another tip on this is I would recommend like a closed container, just to, especially if it's in your house, because it kind of smells, I guess, because it's fermenting, so it gets a bit acidic. Also, if you do have a really airtight container, you might want to just let out the air every couple days if it is a very full container, just to avoid, I don't think it would explode, but I don't know. And then you'll want to dry your seeds fully. You can use lots of different things, like any kind of tray. I typically use parchment paper, but you can really use anything. I wouldn't recommend paper towel because the seeds tend to stick to it, but if paper towel works for you, then that's great. So a few things to keep in mind when you are saving your tomato seeds is you might want to just be aware of crossing and minimum population sizes. So by crossing, we just mean that tomatoes, they can cross-pollinate, even though they are largely self-pollinating crops. So if you had your Alpharora and Stupice really close together, there's a chance that they might have crossed. Generally, 10 to 20 feet is the recommended isolation distance for tomatoes. And it's usually smaller for newer varieties and a larger distance for older varieties, because older varieties have a larger stigma and can cross-pollinate easier. And generally, the standard for community seed saving is you'll need 6 plants to kind of maintain all the genetics in that variety. And for a commercial scale, that's even larger. And it's not to say that something bad will happen if you save seeds from less than 6 plants. It's just over time, if you kept on doing that, you would probably lose some of the genetics within that variety. So yeah, and with that, I thought I'd open the floor to any thoughts about the tomato trial you had, any comments or any questions about tomato seed saving or anything like that. So feel free to turn on your mic or leave a question in the chat box. Okay, I'm feeling like people are probably pretty good on the tomatoes, judging by the silence. So I'll move along to snow peas. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, snow peas. So this year we trialed the Beauregard and Slocan snow pea. For germination, we see it's pretty similar. It was 4.5 for the Beauregard and 4.6 for the Slocan, so not much difference there. Vigor, we see a pretty big difference. Slocan was rated quite a bit higher than Beauregard, which doesn't surprise me. These plants grew really tall quite quickly. And for disease resistance, we barely see a difference between the two. I'd seen on the Facebook groups, some people got powdery mildew on some of them. Some people had a few different diseases, but in general, at ratings at around 4.5, that seems to say that the majority of people didn't have a ton of disease problems. And same for insect resistance, it was pretty high for both of them. As for earliness, we also see a bigger discrepancy here. We can see that the Slocan did quite a bit better than the Beauregard. I personally didn't notice a huge difference at the farm, but definitely this data shows it's quite a big difference. As for flavor, we can see that Slocan did quite a bit better than Beauregard. And the same for yield. Slocan did quite a bit better than Beauregard. Beauregard had a pretty average yield with 3 out of a 1 to 5 stars. So Obviously, you guys have had snow peas that produced much better. And overall, we can see that Slocan did quite a bit better than the Beauregard. So some of the comments for the Beauregard was that it had beautiful flowers, but a small yield and lacking flavor, and would grow for ornamental value only. Some other people said not very tasty, it died in the heat. Beautiful, but the skins are a bit tough and thick. Again, it's really nice that the beautiful deep purple color stays even when cooked. Its flavor is a bit on the bitter side, but it's good in stir fries. Someone else said great color, very petite plants that are compact, good for city garden, but not a huge crop. So we're seeing a lot of comments that go with the lacking flavor and lacking high yield. Unlike one person's who's died in heat, this one withstood the heat dome. It'd also be interesting to look at the map and see, I didn't consider doing that for this, but look at the map and see if there was any correlation between people's plants dying and where they were. Some more were just that the pods were a little bit tough, didn't really like eating them. Someone else said they didn't really fully recover from the heat wave. So a lot of similar comments here. Then for Slocan, we see quite the opposite of the bland and of the Beauregard. We see people saying delicious and abundant, that it's pretty tasty, very vigorous, not a huge yield, but still producing, long period of production. I found that too. In my home garden, all my snow pea plants had died. Well, at least I thought they had in the heat dome because the water didn't quite get there. And then I, surprisingly, like a month after I had abandoned it, I saw a Slocan just somehow had survived that I missed and continued to produce peas for the rest of the summer, which was quite impressive. Someone else just mentioned that this is a tall growing pea, which it was very tall. I probably wouldn't grow Slocan if I was in an apartment. The pea itself is best as a shilling pea. They had some opinions on how it should be eaten. Some people said their pea plants died in the extreme summer heat wave. A couple people said that, but other people said this is a fantastic producer even in adverse conditions and remained tender and sweet. Someone else said, I was very impressed that this variety survived the heat wave and kept producing after. We'll be growing again in this warming world. So again, it was kind of like the Beauregard. It seems like some survived well and some didn't. So the big reveal is the winner is Slocan, and I would say the reasons were it was more vigorous, it grows quickly and reaches tall heights. It also produces earlier, which is nice, and it has higher yields and better flavor than Beauregard. I would say the Beauregard looks really nice, but yeah, unless it wasn't the tastiest pea, I didn't find either. As for would you like to grow this again? Still 56% of people said they would grow Beauregard again. I think that is because it is quite a beautiful pea, and it is pretty cool that you can cook it and still say purple. Makes really, but the Slocan, they had a ton of people, 84% of people said they would grow this again, which I think is pretty impressive. And it's pretty cool that the Slocan snow peas from the Slocan Valley. So I always kind of think maybe it relates to having local adaptation. Some other observations was the heat dome had an effect on the results that varied from person to person. Seems like some people's Slocans died while others didn't, same with Beauregard. Maybe that has to do with irrigation. Maybe that has to do with what direction their peas were facing. You know, peas on a south facing aren't gonna probably fare as well in that high heat as something on a north or east facing area. And a couple of people enjoyed Beauregard snow pea for ornamental value and would just grow it again for that. And it was a really pretty plant. The flowers, especially the nice pale pink flower, I thought were exceptionally gorgeous. So some seed saving tips for Slocan snow peas is to allow the pods to dry on the plant as much as you can. You want to ensure that the seeds inside the pod feel quite hard, like you wouldn't be able to pierce it with your nails. This is always a bit of a balancing act, especially if you're doing peas early spring and harvesting in summer. It should be pretty easy to find long dry period, but if you're growing snow peas later in the year, it can be hard come the fall time to find a good period to harvest your peas. So sometimes if you see in the fall that it's going to be raining for a couple of weeks, you might harvest your peas a bit early, harvest the whole plant and let them dry inside for a few weeks. But even if you do harvest your peas when they are dry outside, you still want to bring them inside and let them dry for a couple of weeks. And then the next step, it's pretty easy pea plants, is you just want to thresh. So for some people that might be just popping up in the pea pods while they're watching TV, or if you have a lot more, people will foot thresh and stomp on it, and then use kind of a fan or something to winnow out the smaller particles and debris. At Farm Folk City Folk, we just got in a thresher in our mobile seed cleaner. So we've been using that for a lot of our pea plants, which has been quite fun and efficient. So there's lots of options for threshing. So now I'll just take a pause and let me know if anybody has any thoughts, comments, or questions on the snow peas. And we were curious if anybody dealt with pea weevils this year. Okay, I guess nobody had pea weevil problems. I'll just carry on. Sorry. Okay, so next we'll go over the beets. So yeah, I kind of just skipped showing all of them for the beets because they were very similar for both varieties, for the Golden Shigoya and the F2 striped gold beet mix. So this is the all traits, like if you select them all and how they balanced off of each other. And the F2 striped gold beet mix is slightly ahead, but it's 3.8 versus 3.6, so not much. And then here's just a few different ones that you can look at. From what I can tell, like they all look pretty similar. All the F2 maybe is a bit higher. The only one where you really see a color difference is the germination. So from that, I might think that that's just a seed storage thing rather than the actual genetics of the plant possibly, or having to be shipped. It's hard to say, but all of it is such very small differences. So the big reveal is there is no clear winner. However, the F2 striped gold mix tended to fare better, with 70% of people saying they would grow it again versus 65% of Golden Shigoya. So it's hard to say if that has any effect. It'd be curious to repeat this trial, maybe change the names and see if you got the same result the next year. The reason is these crosses have the same parents, so they have such similar genetics that we wouldn't expect a huge difference. They have been selected by two different people that had slightly different goals in mind. So that might have changed what they were picking, but at this point at an F2 stage, you're not going to see a huge difference. And by F2, that's just a second generation. So after F1, F2, and generally it can take like 8 generations to get a new stable plant line, even more. So at the F2, a breeding population is still pretty diverse. So now that I was just on the topic of breeding populations, when you are saving seed from a breeding population, you can typically save less seeds because it is so diverse. So sometimes those minimum population sizes, you can get away with picking a bit fewer or having a bit fewer because you're trying to hone down on your genetics versus normally when you're doing line maintenance, you're trying to keep all the genetics. So you want to make sure you have those isolation distances. If that makes sense, feel free to ask a question about that. So seed saving tips for beets is in the fall or summer, you're going to want to select your best and preferred roots. So this population was pretty interesting because we had some that were striped, there were some that were golden, there were some that were pink and red. So you really could have selected for whatever you liked the best. I really like the idea of the gold ones with a bit of striping, which were kind of rare, and I'd be interested in doing that more, but maybe you really like the candy striped look and that's what you would want your beets to look for. It's you kind of the plant breeder. And after you have your beet, you're going to want to take off all the green tops except for a small growing tip. because you're storing these over winter, any vegetation, like any of the green vegetation, can rot. So it's really important to try to get as much of that off as possible. And then you're going to want to store your beets over winter in a root cellar or a bag in the fridge, or stored in sand or wood chips. All in a cold location works well. You're going to want to check every once in a while, probably at least once a month, to see that there's no signs of rotting or signs of mold. And if you see any problems, try to increase the airflow. And then you'll be replanting the roots in early spring. So as early as you can work the soil is really fine to plant these back out, and just make sure your growing tip is showing when you plant them out. And then you can just treat your beets like you normally would, do your regular fertilization plan and cultivation plan. Beets, when you replant them, plants take up more space when they go to seed. So just beware when you're planting it, you're going to want to space them farther apart than you would if you're just eating beets for food. And you may have to provide supports for the beet stalks, or it might be fine just hanging, just depends on your situation. And then you're going to want to harvest the seeds when they are dry and brown. Usually you can just chop off the whole stalk once the whole stalk is dry, but you'll have to go into your field and see for yourself if parts of it need to be harvested early or for whatever reason. So some notes with saving seeds from beets is they can cross with Swiss chard, but unless you've replanted a Swiss chard, left a Swiss chard from last year out, they're not going to get the potential to cross unless they are flowering at the same time. So it's just something to keep in mind. Great. So does anybody have any thoughts, questions, or comments about the beets? Okay, I'm just reading some of these messages. I planted mine in mid-June and they are just starting to size up, but it looks like there are some red ones mixed in. Yeah, if you're talking about the golden shigoya, they were definitely, there's definitely variation in the line still. So even though they're selecting for the gold, it's not quite stable. So we're still seeing those past colors from the parents come up in the population. And then I had somebody just comment about their snow peas sprouting but dying after a couple attempts, but they got commercial peas to grow well with everything sharing the same pots. They think that maybe the shady patio is not good for either of the seed trial varieties, but the commercial peas. And it is true, like if you do just have a shady balcony, definitely things like tomatoes probably aren't going to do super well. Beets, yeah, beets might do all right in shade, but generally sun is better. And snow peas, they kind of like sun too. They all kind of like sun, but I would say snow peas can tolerate more shade than tomatoes or peppers for sure. And they're gonna try again next year, so that's awesome. They had good luck with cherry tomato seedlings from Canadian Tire. They didn't do the seed trial tomatoes as they usually don't have luck with tomatoes. Yeah, I would say sometimes starting tomatoes from seed can be a bit tricky. Like it's, you don't have the right conditions for seed starts, it can be a bit difficult because oftentimes seed starts need quite a bit of light to not get leggy at the beginning. Sometimes they also usually like a bit of warmth. So they can be a bit trickier starting seeds and then transplanting. I always find the easiest things to grow in my garden are the ones I can directly plant, like the peas directly sow. But yeah, I'm sure if anybody else has any tips on starting tomato seeds, you can chime in. Okay, we will have one more opportunity for discussion and questions. So maybe I'll just carry on to the last few of the slides in a minute. Okay, so sorry, There we are. So yeah, I thought we would just end with some seed storage tips, because whether you have seeds from this trial or if you have seeds from other things, it's that time of year where we're getting ready to store them for the winter. So the first step is to harvest from healthy plants that are fully ripened. If you harvest immature seeds, you're just setting yourself up for failure. So it's important to make sure your plant is mature and ready to be harvested. And this will look different for different crops. Like cucumbers, for example, will be really yellow by the time you go to harvest them. And tomatoes, generally you'll want to harvest them a little overripe. And then the other ones, usually you're harvesting once they're kind of brown or dry on the plant, but sometimes rain can interfere harvesting time. So it can be a bit of a tricky time. And then second tip is to make sure your seeds are dry. So if you're harvesting from your garden or your farm, spreading them out evenly as possible without as much overlap is really important. And then another tip is to store in an airtight container. And this is a little tip, but if you are storing an airtight container, just try not to like close the airtight container in a place with lots of humidity. I found like if you store seeds in a fridge, for example, and you open up your seeds in the fridge, your fridge is really humid and you're just letting that humid air into your airtight container. So it's good to find somewhere dry in your house to like open and close it, because you're trying to keep your seeds as dry as possible. So avoiding humidity is really important. And another tip is to keep at an even temperature. A cool, dry, dark place in your home is perfect. So the next slide just kind of goes over some reasons why. And this is from Seeds of Diversity, but because to germinate seeds, we need moisture because it triggers seeds to grow. So to store them, you're looking at the opposite of that, which is dry air. So lower relative humidity is better. And then seeds also need warmth to grow. So the cold is gonna make the seeds consume food slowly so they can store longer. And darkness, some seeds need light to germinate. So it's just good practice to keep them in the darkness. But usually people have seeds in, sometimes you have glass containers, but usually seeds can be in seed packets too, which will maintain the dark. And here's just some reason why those things matter. And it's because here's some Harrington's rules of thumb for seed storage. But for every 1% decrease in seed moisture content between 5 to 14%, this life of the seed doubles. So that's why it's really important to dry your seed as much as you can, not too much. There is such thing as over drying. That's why they say between 5 to 14%, because you're going to be doubling the life, which is awesome. And then another rule of thumb is for every 5 degrees decrease in storage temperature between 0 to 50 degrees, this life of the seed doubles. So that's another reason why the colder you can store it, the better. So some people choose, because cold places are good, to store their seeds in the fridge and refrigerator. And for the freezer, it's especially important to ensure your seeds are dry, because if it has moisture in it, as you know, when you make ice, the water expands. So if you put your seed in the freezer and it has some water in it, it can expand and even shatter the seed, or just affect the inner workings of the seed. You probably won't see the effect, but that kind of growing and swelling can have an effect of it if it's far too wet. And just make sure it's in an airtight container, because the fridge and freezer do have quite high humidity. I mean, you see like a lot of freezers form ice on it. You wouldn't form ice in a freezer if there wasn't humidity there. Another thing people bring up is silica packets. I would say like silica packets are good to use to dry your seeds. As I said before, there is such thing as over drying, so I probably wouldn't recommend leaving the silica packets in the seeds forever, but it'll depend. If your seeds are really moist, you might want to leave it in for a while, but if your seeds are already pretty dry, I would only put it in for a few days. It's also great to put the silica gel in before putting it in the freezer, just to make sure they are super dry. And just the last tip is to properly label. A lot of seeds look exactly the same. Even though they're different varieties, almost all brassica seeds looks the same, and unless you have it labeled, it's really hard to know what is what. Okay, so yeah, if anybody has any seed saving and storage questions, comments, or anything like that, feel free.
I noticed somebody asked there, how would we know what the percentage of moisture is? It's pretty hard to measure that, I think, on the seed itself. But you can get a humidity um, gauge for a room. So the room that I store my seeds in, I have a humidity gauge that shows what the humidity's at. And really for this process, like a dry place under your bed or in your basement, somewhere that's like maintained kind of cool and dry is probably the best place to store them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I'm not sure without scientific materials how you could check the moisture content of your seed. I think it's just more of a feeling thing. If it feels dry and brittle, like you could break it, probably pretty dry. If it feels kind of soft, like you could pierce it, not very dry. Yeah, Harrington Newson's reference. How is it growing hydroponically with lights over winter? What crop is that for? Oh, is that for tomatoes? I don't know much about growing hydroponically over winter. I know that that's becoming a bigger thing in Canada, especially for tomatoes. I don't know if you know anything, David?
I actually just had somebody ask me today about a good variety to grow, not even with lights, but in a window over winter. Tomatoes are perennial plants that we grow as annuals. I have grown them in 1-gallon pots on my windowsill and harvested tomatoes into December. We don't have a lot of light here, so your yield is very low. You get the odd tomato producing, but it might be, that might be an interesting trait to look at or breed for, maybe a tomato that does well in lower light for indoor growing. You probably wouldn't want something too gangly and long and big either, but I'd say experiment and try it out.
Yeah, I can imagine something smaller that produces fast and earlier would probably be the best for that kind of application. For tomato seed saving, I didn't have any tomatoes actually ripen on the vine this year. Is it viable to save seeds from window ripened tomatoes? It's better to save them from the ones that have ripened on the plants, for sure. Even ones that have like over ripened and fallen off of the plants, those are like the best ones. As for saving seeds from window ripened on tomatoes, I'm not sure. I think they would probably germinate some of them, but you're not going to have as high of a germination. Um,
Yeah,
and you'd want to look at how the seeds look, and if they float when you put them in water, they definitely wouldn't be viable. But if they do sink in water, there's a chance that they might be all right. Do you have anything to add, David?
I'd just say, like, if those are the only ones you have and you want to save seeds from them, they're your best bet. So like they could work if you ripen them on your windowsill. If you're relying on those for your seeds for next year, I would definitely do a germination test first, because you don't want to start your seeds, in March, and then 2 weeks later find out that none of them germinated and you have to start over again. So that would just be my recommendation. But it's easy enough to do a germination test on them. Sometimes we don't get to work with the ideal in seed saving. Sometimes you have to bring plants in during the wet weather when they're not fully ripened, because you're not going to get anything if you don't. So, if you left those unripe tomatoes on the plant, they would freeze and you definitely wouldn't get seeds. So the right thing was to bring them into the window and let them ripen up, I'd say. Yeah.
Great. Well, there's a couple more slides just about some of our upcoming events, but at the end, if you have any more questions, we'll just answer them then. I thought we could have an open discussion about Citizen Seed Trial 2022. So we're looking for crop suggestions, topics of interest, and by this we kind of mean, like, is there certain things you guys are interested in? Like, is is geography interesting to you, like how things perform in different regions, or like adverse conditions like drought, or would you be more interested in like container type gardens and doing comparisons that way? So that's what we kind of mean by topics of interest. And if you guys have any engagement ideas, we're also open to hearing those. And then we've been talking about doing a citizen public breeding project next year, which would be kind of you guys helping us out doing some of our breeding projects. So we have a few breeding projects going on at the farm, such as a Brussels sprouts white winter kale project, a few red carrot breeding projects, and a watermelon breeding project. So we're thinking about launching that this year. And then later this week, we'll be sending out a survey to participants about their opinions of kind of crops to grow next year and how they found this year's program. So just stay tuned for that. So I'll just open up the chat and feel free to chime in if you have any thing to add about CST 2022.
Yeah, and thanks for putting your like you could feel free to just add comments to the chat box. We'll save that later for reference. Or if you want to unmute yourself and put your hand up and speak, you can too. I'll just very quickly go over our initial idea about the citizen public breeding project. It would involve us sending out a number of seeds from some of these breeding projects we have. They're very diverse populations, so they're not uniform crops yet. And we would look to individuals we send them to make their own selections of what they would like to select for. So say we send watermelon and you like yellow watermelon, you would select the yellow one, maybe take a picture of it, save the seeds, send them back, and we'll send them to other people the following year to keep growing those out. And so it'll be an ongoing breeding project. So yeah, anybody that wants to be involved in citizen breeding project for the next decade or so, let us know. And yeah, the comment about tomato seeds sent earlier, we're really trying to get on top of that. It's a lot of work to figure out what crops we're doing, which varieties we're doing, and then sourcing the seeds for them. Ideally, we would have that done in the next month or so we can order seeds early if need be. But yes, we keep intending to send seeds out earlier.
I have one little fun factoid, if you guys are into it, for this candy stripe beets. Last year I worked at a farm and everybody pronounced that word differently. So we decided to look up the pronunciation, and it's actually Kioja.
Kioja.
Yeah, so we all learned it, and now everybody at the farm tries to say the same word because we're all saying different things. Just a fun little factoid.
I was looking at like a Chicory Week bingo, and one of the bingo squares was learn how to pronounce Kijoga. Kioja. And one of them was, yeah, learn how to pronounce Kioja. That's awesome. Which I thought was funny, and I didn't even do it. I failed that bingo.
Somebody mentioned radicchio. Maybe we've been doing radicchio as part of our Canovi trial. So we had 15 farmers across BC and over 50 of them across the country trialing up to 27 different varieties of radicchio. So yeah, if you feel like putting any more information into the chat box about what you were thinking in terms of a radicchio trial, there's so many different classes and diversities of radicchio. If your crop suggestions, it's useful if you give us the crop and then what you think would be interesting to find out about the crop. So for example, radicchio, different varieties have very different maturing dates. And that was one of the things we were looking at in the Canovi trials. So yeah.
Yeah. Also in radicchio, there's different types. Like there's a more lettuce type like Castelfranco, and then there's more kind of endive shape like the Treviso, and the round ones. I think those are called Kioja as well. Yeah, the round ones, yes. And then the Verona, which are kind of egg-shaped.
Mhm.
And Delucia, which is shaped differently too. Okay, just
Nice.
oh, they're growing Delucia right now. Oh, very cool. What varieties?
I think Delucia is sometimes listed as a variety.
Oh yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, because it's a type and a variety.
Mhm.
Right.
Some of the herbs, I see suggestions of like rosemary and chives. Some of those are a bit tricky because they're usually propagated by cuttings asexually. And when you do propagate them by seed, sometimes they can be, rosemary would take a long time to produce. You know, you get a tiny little plant at the end of the season. Probably not much chance for seed production. But again, if there's something specific you're interested in finding out about these things, let us know.
Yeah, and I'll let comments keep rolling in. I'll just go to our next slide. So just wanted to let you guys know that we have the BC Seed Gathering coming up on November 19th to the 21st, and it's virtual this year. So if you're not near KPU, it'll be easy to join. So you can join us for a variety of CD presentations, a tasting and recipe swap, live music, and more. We're also organizing on a session on citizen science, and we'll be talking about this trial and seedling, which will be exciting. I'll send out the link to those in the CST group in the case they want to join that session. It'll be a really fun time. We have lots of interesting seed topics. If you came to our virtual CD Saturday event in February, you'll probably enjoy this BC Seed Gathering. Most of the sessions are on this Saturday, the 20th, but there will be a few sessions on the 21st. And on the 19th, we have a group for community organizers. So if you run a CD Saturday or if you have a seed library, there might be some interesting meetings for you on the Friday. So yeah, just be, we'll be doing, you'll probably see this on your Facebook and in your emails, but yeah, be sure to register if you're interested. Okay, and thank you very much. And I'll just let us keep on talking about CST 22, or just if you want to stay on the call, we'll be wrapping it up by 6.
Lisa, you mentioned pilgrim's cabbage. Is that a type of collard? I know there's pilgrim's cabbage and then there's also collards, but
You know, I don't know that much about it. I know it's a green that grows really well here. And it's similar to collards. That's about as much as I know. It grows into like a pillar and it will just grow and grow and grow through the winter, at least here on the coast. And I'm not sure how it performs in other parts of BC, but could be.
And are there more than one variety you know of, or?
Not that I know of.
Yeah, I've only seen it as pilgrim's cabbage, but it might be interesting if people are interested in collards to compare a pilgrim's cabbage to a collard or something, because they seem pretty similar.
Yeah.
I think pilgrim's cabbage tends to be softer leaves, like probably not as thick as collard, but
yeah, well, collards would be great too, just because they're so delicious and not very many people know that.
Yeah, I haven't had them much. I haven't really heard of it.
Somebody's suggesting Gerald corn, beans, and squash. That's an interesting idea. I think for the trial, we would want to try different types of corn, different types of beans, different types of squash. We did actually grow 2 types of green beans at the farm this year, which we could use for the citizen seed trial next year. One is like a fine fillet bean and one is just an easy picking bean. So if people like the idea of a green bean, we could certainly do that.
Yeah. As for corn, we did painted mountain corn last year. I don't know if there'd be a good one to compare to that, but it was kind of an interesting crop, very beautiful kernels.
And Three Sisters planting is a little, can be challenging in our climate, you know, where that originates. It's hotter and drier, and the corn grows really huge, so it acts as a great support for beans. And it just, in our climate, it can be a little tricky. But it would be a neat experiment to see, you know, to figure out planting times for different varieties. But it sounds like it might be a complicated citizen seed project.
Yeah, it would be really interesting culturally, but yeah, I've never tried it, but I've been interested in trying it at some point. Somebody says, yeah, beans.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll have quite a bit of seed from that. That was one this year where it was a bit tricky to harvest because it was rainy for a long time, and trying to let them, that was definitely one of those where we had to harvest a bit early and let them dry a bit inside because it was a bit wet and I didn't space them out enough. But you're always learning from farming.
Yeah, and if you're interested in a type of bean, a colored bean or a pole bean or something, let us know too. The ones we have are just 2 bush green beans. That might be interesting to compare.
I'd be interested in comparing them because they seem similar but different. But probably some interesting differences between them.
When you guys did painted mountain corn, when did you plant it? Like in the ground?
You know, we actually transplanted it, I'm pretty sure. Yes, we did transplant it. We didn't direct sow. I can actually find the exact date for you if you like.
I'm just wondering because I'm a middle school teacher, but I don't have my own class, so it's a lot hard for me to implement all the like data collection, and I'm trying to get other teachers in the school who do have their own classes to kind of take this on and start citizen science when they're like 12 years old. And we have just like a few beds at the school. So this past spring, I signed up for the trial hoping I would be able to implement it, but there was just so much going on at the school that we're going to try to take the seeds that you sent us this year and still try them next year. I feel like that'll be viable. And I'm grateful you mentioned that the fridge is moist because they're all in packages in the fridge. So I guess I'll put them to a cup.
Yeah, or just even a jar. Like a lot of seed packets in a jar is a really nice way to store it in the fridge, I find.
Okay, so still in the fridge, just in a jar.
Yeah.
Or for long-term storage, sometimes you put them in the freezer because it's actually a lot drier than the fridge.
Right.
But again, you don't, just be careful of fluctuating temperatures. So pulling them out of the freezer and in again, you know.
I was apprehensive too because the thermostat at the school is not super stable there. So I thought maybe the fridge or freezer would be.
If you can also, since you're a teacher, it sounds like you were engaging with your class with the citizen seed trial. If you can think of ways that it would make it easier for you to do that as a school, we would love to hear that. We are starting a project where we're starting to work with some schools and school libraries on some of this. And yeah, it would be great to figure out the best way to do that. So for schools, it would need to be crops that you could plant in like May, June and harvest in September, October.
Yeah.
So yeah, painted mountain corn would be a really nice one for that.
One teacher at our school, I'm on Quadra Island, but the school's in Campbell River. And then we've got a friend down in like Parksville area who inspired us to start a seed library. So we started a seed library at the school, but it's just in its infancy. So anyone with any experience or knowing of schools that have seed libraries, maybe I'll just put my email in the chat, and that would be super rad to connect. We also got a grant we started like a grow station, like a seed starting grow station in the classroom and a seed library, and then invited different classes in the school to start their own tray. And then students either took those starts home and transplanted them in their gardens at home, or we planted them in the school garden. But yeah, just starting out, and then timing of seasons and school and teacher workload is all happening.
Yeah. It needs to just be part of your job and the curriculum, so you don't have to do it off the side of your desk.
It'd be the
That's
best.
our long-term goal, is to have
Definitely.
seed saving and gardening embedded into the school curriculum.
Oh
So,
yeah.
Yep.
I'm pretty
So
sure
the
we're
painted,
we're
oh,
close.
sorry. Yeah, the painted mountain corn, we planted second week of May, and we transplanted it at the end of May.
You plant, sorry, at second week of May, you
We seeded it,
seeded.
and then we transplanted it outside. We used small cells last year.
Okay.
So we transplanted, so we transplanted end of May, but if you had bigger cells, you might wait a bit longer to transplant it outside.
Okay. Right. And then that would be ready when they got back in September.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's a
And
it's a very hardy short season corn. It's one of the shortest. So you can, even if you push the date a little bit and planted, at the end of the school year, I'm sure you'd still get a crop.
okay.
It also does really well with neglect. So if you don't have a really great garden program over the summer, I've seen it produce corn with no water at all in a very dry field. So
Okay. Awesome. Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, I think at our BCC gathering, we might have some interesting sessions on schools and connecting seed saving to the curriculum, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So you were going to send the link out to register.
Yes, yeah, I'll send that in the email of the survey.
Okay. Oh, that's so awesome. Thank you guys. I'll definitely stay in touch about ways to make it accessible for teachers.
mhm. Yeah, and feel free to reach out if you if you have any requests for support in your school program that you think we might be able to help with. Let us know
Cool.
for sure.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I guess we're at 6 o'clock. So I guess we can wrap this up. But thank you guys all for participating in the 2021 Citizen Seed Trial. The seed link will be open till about just after the seed gathering. So you can feel free to input any last minute data or any, just complete your trials if you haven't completed those already. And yeah, it'll be an email sometime later this week with survey and some information about our past webinars if you want to watch old videos. And I guess that's it. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope everybody has a awesome evening.
Thanks, Yuri.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.